This is Common Sense Radio. Straightforward and no excuses.
All right. Come on now.
This is the Steve Gruber Show.
Call me crazy.
Oh, yeah.
What I said was perfectly right and spot on accurate.
Boy's got a mouth like a cannon, always shooting it all.
Stop. Yeah, stop. I mean, you're way off script.
Got it in me. Gonna quit until it all comes out.
Hey, boy!
Been a long education.
Yeah, you know, it's not cynical. It's common sense.
Pay attention to me when I'm talking to you.
I'm gonna rock the nation. Rock the nation.
Genuine, accountable, and raw. Here is Steve Gruber.
Tuesday, and welcome to the Steve Gruber Show. So much to talk about today. So many headlines here today that it's almost, it's one of those days I'm looking at everything here. Where do you start? Donald Trump declaring war on Obama trade. A school in Wyoming cancels America Day because it's too patriotic. Illegal aliens could elect Hillary Clinton. Joe Biden could jump in the race as early as next week. You know, the floods in South Carolina continue. A woman who identifies as blind, what does she do about it? Dumps drain cleaner in her own eyes because she's felt like she's blind her whole life, so she made herself blind. If that's not mental illness, you tell me what is. Ted Cruz comes to Michigan, nothing short of crazy to take in Syrian Muslim refugees, he says, during his stop here in Kalamazoo on Monday. Anyhow, just a pile of stuff here. I'm going to start with the shooter in Oregon, though, in Roseburg, Oregon. In his writings, he ranted about how he was sane, everyone else was crazy, and that he couldn't get a girlfriend. This is the second time we've had this where the guy can't get a date, so he goes and kills other people. I mean, really? Sexually frustrated, and he takes it out by killing people. Campus at Umpqua Community College will not reopen until next week. The campus there will reopen. Classes will start next week. Some folks returning, though, to pick up some things that they had lost. The memorial there growing. Barack Obama has been told by the city council there of Roseburg, though, don't come here. Don't bring your political show here. We don't want to see it. At least one of the students that was injured in the shooting last week returned yesterday. That, according to college president Rita Caven, she did not identify the student. Chaplains who had been on campus said they were both helping with and participating in the healing process. I'm going through the grieving process myself because this has touched everyone in the community, says Chaplain Russell Wilson. If you don't know someone that goes here, you know someone that knows someone, and so on and so forth. So as you can imagine, this has sparked a conversation that, well, has garnered me some heat. Apparently some people thought that I had said yesterday that I support gun registration. I do not. I said I hadn't gone that far yet, but I do believe that background checks are completely appropriate. We do them for the majority of gun purchases, but not for all. During this process, the shooter's mother said that he was battling mental problems. No kidding. Maybe you could have mentioned that to somebody. You've got an apartment full of guns, and you don't mention the fact that your son, who's 26 years old and lives at home with mommy, has mental problems. Now, the slippery slope of mental problems is exactly that. The problem being that if you make it too easy, well, you know, that guy's on an antidepressant, that guy's got this problem or that problem, and they take away your ability to have a firearm, make it too easy, in effect creating a gun ban. for any small transgression, anything perceived, well, that guy down the street doesn't act quite right. Well, boom, he's banned. It can't be that. Anyhow, I was getting a fair amount of pushback on social media yesterday from folks who didn't support that idea. Said, well, you start that and you're going down the slippery slope and so on and so forth. Come on. Gun owners, listen. Then I'm one of you. You listen. Background checks are coming, and that's the way it's going to be. It's not going to be background checks sometimes. It's not going to be background checks if you go to the gun store. It's not going to be once in a while. It's going to be it's going to be always. If you buy a gun from a private party, you'll be required to fill out the yellow sheet. As you should. And what would the big deal be? Well, it's going to be a pain. It's going to be a hassle. Well, too bad. It's a hassle going to the Secretary of State's office, too, but you do it, don't you? The hotline number, 888-900-9966, 888-900-9966. But, Steve, then what happens when they realize that doesn't stop mass killings? Well, we'll talk about that then. But the fact of the matter is I don't want people to sell shotguns to perfect strangers out of the classified ads. Those perfect strangers might have bigger intentions. Those perfect strangers might hail from someplace where they might want to start a jihad. So whether it'll stop it or not, I want to say that I want, the yellow sheet filled out for long guns and private sales as well. Not going to make me a lot of friends here, probably, but the fact of the matter is it's a common sense thing to do. Why would you have background checks at all if you're not going to background check everybody? If you're going to do 60% or 70%, why bother? Triple 888-900-9966, the place to join the conversation if you're so inclined. Also, you can go to stevegruber.com. Well, see, and then I've got the pushback that says that this is a step along the way to the ultimate goal of no guns. Well, there's truth to that. Make no mistake, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders want you to have no guns, no private ownership of firearms. I don't agree with that. You don't agree with that. But I agree with background checks, and I agree that there should be some. I mean, let's be honest. There's a lot of American citizens that I don't believe should have a firearm. Hello, let me point your attention to Roseburg, Oregon. I'm just reading that this is a step in the step of socialism. Well, that's not socialism. To protect yourself and to use common sense. If you want to call it socialism, you call it whatever you want. Because the other direction is to get rid of all background checks. Because if you're not going to do them for everybody, why do them at all? Again, 888-900-9966. We'll have more, and we're going to talk to Dr. John Lott in just a moment. We're going to diffuse some of the myths that are put forth every time there's a shooting about gun-free zones, gun laws, and everything else. We'll be right back. It's Tuesday on the Steve Gruber Show.
Taking a closer look at the stories that affect you most with a big dose of common sense.
Sheepdog, standing in the rain. Bullfrog, doing it again.
All right, welcome back to it. It is Tuesday here on the Steve Gruber Show. The conversation focusing around firearms this morning. As you can imagine, that hasn't gone away yet. We'll get to some of the other topics of the day from the headlines that I was reading for you. But first, Dr. John Lott, the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center here, the leading voice on common sense when it comes to gun ownership and gun statistics, not the emotion of guns, but gun statistics. Doctor, welcome back to the program.
Good to talk to you again, Steve.
I know you're traveling today, and I appreciate you taking the time. A couple of quick things. First of all, in his remarks immediately following the shooting, the president said it's clear, how I'm going to paraphrase, that those places that have the strictest gun laws have the least amount of shootings, which, he's from Illinois with Chicago, right off the get-go. It seems to me he's spewing garbage.
Right. Well, I guess I don't take it seriously when he says that. I mean, there are a number of things that they do in order to kind of manipulate that. Most of those, almost 2/3 of the shootings that he's including are suicides. And the thing is, there's a lot of suicides in rural areas of this country, mainly because you have older men who are, the male-female balance is way out of whack in those places. And, you just have a fair number of suicides that are there. But to go and blame that on gun ownership is not something that I take particularly seriously, or the amount of gun control laws that are there. There are lots of ways for people to kill and commit suicide in lots of different places. And just, I just think that's kind of a misrepresentation to include those. Plus, there are lots of little funny things that they do with the data on that. For example, when they look at stand your ground laws, which they're including in this mix, there's a number of states that have stand your ground laws as a result of court decisions. But they're not counting those. Somehow it seems to matter to them whether the stand your ground laws are put in effect as the state legislature or they're in effect as a result of some past court decision. It's not exactly obvious to me why there should be a distinction there, and there are other issues there too, but it's just take the claims very seriously.
Right, clearly manipulating the statistics, as a lot of folks do. My question is this. What can be done? I mean, they make it as if there's some magical law out there that's been hanging around that the Republicans and the NRA are blocking, because the NRA, there are calls from some Democrats to, label the National Rifle Association as a terrorist group, which would be akin to, blaming AAA for, drunk driving. To me, I mean, the blaming the NRA for a mass shooting in Oregon is like blaming the American Automobile Association for drunk driving anywhere in the country. It doesn't. There's no connection there. But what can we do?
Well, I mean, just first of all, I think people are making this point now, but the law that the president keeps pushing, the so-called expanded background checks, would have had nothing. He's out there in public just hours after the attack, before we even knew how the killer had obtained his weapons, and it quickly became clear that the law was completely irrelevant in that case, just as it's been completely irrelevant in all these other cases that he keeps emphasizing. Everyone that he's spoken about during his administration, the law that he pushes for this would have had absolutely no impact.
Let me ask you about that, though. You're right about that. But let me ask you this. Background checks, if you go to a gun store, you fill out your yellow sheet. If you go to most, the gun show thing, most of those places have dealers. You fill out the yellow sheet. But private sales between individuals, there's no yellow sheet and so on and so forth. I mean, wouldn't it make more sense just to do background checks on every gun exchange as opposed to 60% or 70%? Why do 60 or 70% if you're not going to do them all?
Well, first of all, I think the number is over 90%. That 60% number that everybody keeps pushing was on a survey that was done even before the Brady Act went into effect, primarily. And but beyond that, the current background check system's a real mess. Virtually everybody who gets stopped is a false positive. The real cost to this, in the sense that, when you have these background checks dealing with private transfers, you're adding, the state of New York, you add about $80 onto the cost of transferring a gun. In Washington State, you're adding about $60 onto the cost of transferring a gun. In D.C., you're adding about $200 onto the cost of transferring a gun. Those are real costs. And I think the main reason that they're pushing this isn't because they believe that it's going to stop crime any more than it's going to stop these mass public shootings that they keep on pointing to. I think the reason why they push this is that they want to reduce gun ownership. And one of the ways to go and reduce gun ownership is just to make it more costly for people to go and get guns. But, if they were serious, there are two things that they could do that I think would reduce a lot of the opposition to this. One is, if they really believe that this reduces crime, and I don't, but if they really believe that, then go pay for it out of general revenue. Okay? And but they won't do that. They go crazy when you bring up paying for out of general revenue, even if they're claiming that everybody's supposedly going to benefit from lower crime.
And real quickly, number two.
And it's for the reason why I said before. They don't care about that. They care about making it costly for people to get guns. Second point is that fix it so that not everybody who's being stopped is a false positive. People who should have been able to, but they simply have a name and a birthday similar to the people that they're trying to stop.
CrimeResearch.org is where you'll find Dr. John Lott. It's the Steve Gruber Show.
Michigan, born and raised with Midwestern values and Michigan common sense.
You'll take my life, but I'll take yours too. You fire musket, but I'll run you through. So when you're waiting for the next attack, you better stand, there's no turning back.
It's Tuesday, 33 after the hour. It's the Steve Gruber Show. You can join the conversation, 888-900-9966, 888-900-9966. You can find out more at stevegruber.com as well, where you can click the Listen Live button, take us to work every day. Or go there and click the podcast button and hear past interviews, past programs. It has entire hours of the show, plus selected interviews as well. So check it out, stevegruber.com. Our next guest is Major Daniel Sjursen, who just wrote the new book, Ghost Riders of Baghdad, Soldiers, Civilians, and the Myth of the Surge. Is currently serving in the United States Army and is a history instructor at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Major, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be here.
So tell me about this book, first of all, Ghost Riders of Baghdad, how you came to write it and what the focus, the premise of this book truly is.
Okay, well, Steve, I actually started writing the book as a bit of an angry essay. I'd been sitting at home in my duplex during graduate school in Lawrence, Kansas. I was at graduate school en route to teach at the military academy, and Senator Lindsey Graham was talking about the war in Iraq, and he was essentially claiming that because President Barack Obama had pulled the soldiers out of Iraq, that all the successes that we had seen in the surge had thus evaporated, and just spoken along those lines. And that was not the impression that I had had serving in Iraq during the surge. So I started to write an essay that developed into a book for several reasons, but the main one is that I hadn't been happy with every other book that I'd seen on the Iraq War, because they tended to follow one of two paths. The first one was that it was a straight memoir, one officer talking about his own platoon and the experience of that platoon, and there's been some great work, but I felt that all those books fell short of really hitting the key themes of the war. And then the other type of book is just the broader history of the Iraq War. I hope to do both. So I wrote.
Now hold on. I'm trying to figure out this point that you've made here. I'm trying to figure out this point that you've made here that that you're telling me that Barack Obama, his pulling the American military out en masse and not leaving back a number of troops behind didn't lead to the collapse, didn't lead to what we're dealing with now. I mean that would be in contrary to pretty much everything I've heard from military people, both active and retired. And you call it the myth of the surge. Please explain.
Well, so I think that one of the problems that Americans have is that we place ourselves at the center of everything. We like to place ourselves at the center of causality. For example, the idea that had America just stayed longer in Iraq, that we could have avoided ISIS, when in reality, ISIS and the collapse of of any stability we had in Iraq is as much a function of leaving behind an extremist Shia government that alienated the Sunni population, and many of the tactics that we used during the surge, such as paying off former insurgents to fight on our side, insurgents who had at one time been killing Americans, many of whom are now serving alongside in the ranks of ISIS.
So you're telling me the surge didn't work at all then? I'm trying to understand, because again, that's contrary to anything we've ever been told.
Sure.
By and large,
right.
We were told totally different things. So you're saying that Barack Obama's actions had no long-term impact. It would have made no difference if we had stayed longer, not stayed longer.
No impact at all. I wouldn't say no impact at all. But I would say that the implication that the United States was at the center of causality for whether or not ISIS formed, whether leaving behind 10,000 troops would have stopped that, I think it's unlikely that would have stopped ISIS from forming. And let me say this as well. The Iraqi government is the reason that we didn't leave soldiers behind. The Iraqi government refused to sign a SOFA. They did not want American troops to stay behind. So that's another thing that is often forgotten in the story. Now, I don't think that the surge was a complete failure. What I believe is that the myth is that the surge was able to stabilize Iraq in any final sense. The surge may have given us some limited short-term tactical success, but the idea that the surge was a strategic success or that it ever had the potential to be a full strategic success is a fallacy. And again, a typical American problem of placing ourselves at the center of all causality in foreign affairs.
We're on the line with Major Daniel Sjursen, author of Ghost Riders of Baghdad, Soldiers, Civilians, and the Myth of the Surge. I'm going to take issue with some of the things that you've pointed out here. Barack Obama's foreign policy has been an abject failure pretty much on every front, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, or Syria, or some would argue the Trans-Pacific trade policies and partnerships. And your position, you're basically saying that Barack Obama pulling the troops out had really no appreciable effect on what was going to happen. Basically, this is where we were going to end up anyway. I mean, to boil it down, that's what I'm getting out of it.
I do believe that the invasion of Iraq was an unqualified catastrophe, not only for
that's a different topic,
but more
and I don't disagree with that. That's a different subject, Major. I stay on task here. That's a different topic. We could debate whether going into Iraq was right or wrong. Yeah, and many people thought that it was right, and then later decided it was not a good decision, me included. We're talking about the surge here, what happened afterwards. Once we went in, we had an obligation, I believe, to stay and to finish the job. And from the observation of myself and dozens of other military people I've watched on a variety of places and read their work and so forth, we left it in a shambles and didn't do our work on the back end. It doesn't matter that George Bush made a mistake going in. That's not the topic. The topic is what do we do once we went in, and how do we keep it and stabilize it? And you're saying that what Barack Obama did, yeah, we were going to leave. It would have happened 5 years from now, 10 years. It made no difference.
I would argue that it made very little difference. And we haven't addressed
you're splitting
the Iraqi government that we left. We haven't addressed the fact that the Iraqi government that we left behind is the very government that asked American soldiers to leave when we did. So the government, dominated by extremist Shias who did not wish to work with the moderate Sunni factions, the government that we put in place during the surge, the government that was supposed to be stabilized by our actions, the sacrifices and the deaths of our soldiers during the surge, was the very government that asked us to leave. And they refused to work with moderate Sunnis upon our departure.
Yeah, and every person until you, to a man, that I've talked to about this subject, about the Standard of Forces Agreement, said the United States, that Barack Obama collapsed and gave in to something he never should have as far as the Standard of Forces Agreement, and that if we had maintained a presence higher than what we left behind, that the outcome would have been very different. You were the first person I've ever heard, frankly, sir, to ever argue otherwise. Not saying you're wrong.
I'm
just saying
that's one of the reasons I wrote the book.
If you could hold 1 second, we're taking a break here. Hold on. Major, hold your position right there just for 1 second. Major Daniel Sjursen here on the program. Ghost Riders of Baghdad, his book. We'll be back in just a moment right here on the Steve Gruber Show.
The Steve Gruber Show, American Values with Midwestern Common Sense.
Tuesday here on the program. Phone number is 888-900-9966. You're welcome to get on board. Major Daniel Sjursen here, author of Ghost Riders of Baghdad, Soldiers, Civilians, and the Myth of the Surge. Major, as I said before we went to the break, you're the first person I've ever heard that said that that the surge is a myth and that it didn't work. You're also the first person to suggest that I talk to people all the time. Not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying your position is fairly unusual from the military point of view and from those that worked and served in Baghdad, from enlisted people to commanders. I've talked to all those folks and everybody in between along the years here. So let me ask you this. Do you support President Obama's foreign policies regarding what we're doing with ISIS or Syria or Afghanistan at this point? You say that him leaving Iraq would have had little difference on the end result, and in fact, maybe none. The surge really made no difference long term and maybe made little difference short term. Do you support his policies and how we're dealing with ISIS currently, or Syria or Afghanistan or any of it?
Well, it's not really my place to make judgments as a serving officer on current policy of the commander-in-chief with regard to ISIS. But Steve, if I may, I would like to try to summarize some of the ideas as to why I believe the surge was in fact a myth, or the successes of the surge were in fact a myth.
Sure. I'm trying to understand it, so please.
Yeah, so I think one of the main things to understand is that many serving military officers feel the need, and it's a psychological one, to believe that there was an opportunity for success and something that they sacrificed so much for. We've all deployed several times. I've been in Iraq and Afghanistan. Most officers that I've served with have served several times in all the theaters. And I do believe that there's a psychological need to believe that with just a little more effort, with just a little more time, we could have snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. Because it is a very difficult thing to sacrifice and then to see all that sacrifice appear to be for naught when you see something like ISIS form. But let me speak about the surge briefly. The surge did lower violence, and that is undoubtedly the case. But we have to look at why that happened, and we have to look at whether it was sustainable. So the first point is that the sectarian civil war had already raged for a year, 2 years by the time that any of the surge forces got on the ground. Areas of Baghdad and the rest of the country had become segregated by Sunni and Shia in a way that they had never been segregated before. Essentially, the lines had already been drawn. One of the reasons that violence went down was because Baghdad divided between a Sunni West and a Shia South and a Shia East. The second reason is that we actually had the tribes switch sides, the Sunni tribes, and join the side of the Americans because they saw what became al-Qaeda in Iraq as a greater threat. They decided to do that on their own, and then we paid them to fight on our side. And finally, Muqtada al-Sadr's Shia army, the Mahdi army, decided for internal reasons, because of disorganization internally and a lack of discipline, to call a ceasefire. All three of these things happened early in the surge, which helped to lower violence. That does not mean that the United States Army had nothing to do with it. It means the United States Army was only one of three major factors that caused violence to go down. Now, upon the surge ending, there was never a stable government in Iraq that was in place that was going to be able to maintain this country in any sort of order. We had a Shia extremist government that did not want to work with those former Sunni tribes who had been previously our enemy and were now paid off to be on our side. And so I guess what I'm arguing is, when that Shia government, which we had put in place during the surge, asked us to leave, there were few options on the table for the United States Army. And to expect that the United States Army's presence would have been enough.
How convenient, though, that it fit right into a campaign promise is my point. It fit conveniently into a campaign promise the way it's laid out and the way it was related to you and the rest of the American people. I mean, how convenient we can leave. We can wash our hands of this. And the term that I hear most often is stabilizing force. We left nobody behind to help out in case of emergency, if you will. Well, the emergency came, Major, and there was nobody there to call, and there's nobody there to help. And today, it's in worse condition than it's been since before it all began, before 2003. So you tell me, what was the right course of action? I mean, we can't go back and not, we can't rewrite what happened in 2003. But what we've done since then seems to be an aggravation of the situation and not really solving any problems. And I do think you're in a position to make opinions about where we are currently with our policies towards ISIS, Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. You've written this book. You clearly have policy and things you agree with and disagree with, and to say that you don't want to answer those questions because of current policies, I think, is a bit disingenuous.
Well, I think that it's very difficult to say what would have been the best policy because the fact of the matter is that the United States was not in a position to determine policy in Iraq. I mean, the idea, we like to place ourselves at the center of everything, but the reality is there was an Iraqi government in place, and that Iraqi government asked the United States to leave. Now, we could have overridden that and just decided, well, we're staying anyway, but think about the long-term implications of that. And as for current policy, I think that there's been some successes, many failures, and the reality is what we're dealing with now is the outgrowth of a government that we left in place during the surge that refused to work with moderate Sunnis, alienated those individuals, and then the former enemies of the United States, who we paid to work on our side, largely joined the ISIS cause. I mean, much of this can be seen. You have a nihilistic youth that grew up under 8, 9, 10 years of war that we unleashed upon the nation of Iraq through an ill-advised invasion. And those individuals are now who serves in ISIS. I mean, not everyone in ISIS is an extremist Muslim. Many of the people in ISIS are actually fighting for the Sunni cause and are willing to get behind the more extremist rhetoric, and as just a cover for what they're trying to achieve regionally.
All right, we're going to leave it there, Major. It's Major Daniel Sjursen, author of The Ghost Riders of Baghdad, Soldiers, Civilians, and the Myth of the Surge. You can find the book in all the usual places, and you can decide for yourself based on this conversation, based on the book. Major, I greatly appreciate your time. It's a good conversation.
Oh, great. Enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
There you